So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center, Bard College. We, in our virtual reading group, are reading the Jewish Writings, a collection edited by Ron Feldman and Jerry Cohn. It's an exceptionally historically and politically rich text that we are reading today. A series of articles that Arendt wrote in the German Jewish publication Aufbau between October 1941 and November 1942, called The Jewish War That Isn't Happening. Before I dive into that, let me just welcome Susan Oberman, who has been running alongside the virtual reading group for now, I think almost 2 years, a series of dialogue groups that allow people in the virtual reading group to dig deeper into the text and these discussions on in a smaller group level. So Susan wanted to just make an announcement about that. Hello, Susan.
Hi. So we do have 4 new groups getting started, and they are scheduled, and people can come as is possible. And if you're getting my emails about it, then you don't have to register. If you aren't getting the emails and you'd like to find out about it, I'm happy to send that to you. Just register, and I'll put the link to the Hannah Arendt Center webpage in the chat.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Yeah, I know that a lot of people have found these dialogue groups to be a great supplement to what we're doing. And so I encourage you, if you have the interest, to reach out to Susan. She'll put her contact in the chat, as she said, and it's a great opportunity. Okay, so how do we make sense of these texts? These are very short, in a sense, opinion columns. Hannah Arendt is a stateless refugee who's been in New York for a short time. She's writing in German, largely to German Jews, in the German Jewish publication Aufbau. I was just talking with Jana right before you all came in about who the addressee of these articles is, and obviously these articles written in 1941 and 1942 in Aufbau are addressed largely to a German-speaking Jewish refugee community in the United States. And I think we have to, on the one hand, read them with that kind of historical political understanding. I think that raises fascinating questions. To what extent we today, I say we in a somewhat vague way, but we today are the addressee or not of these columns, newspaper columns. I mean, who is the addressee today? Is it Jews today? Or is it any minority group today? Who can, what is this, such a historically specific situation that we can't take much from it? Or is there actually something to be learned and to be thought about today, and who are the addressees? So I think these are some of the questions worth our pondering and hopefully discussing when we get into the discussion. The first thing I'll say is that the most important word in the title, now the title, of course, is not her title. It's the title that the editors gave to this section, The Jewish War That Isn't Happening, is isn't. Arendt is arguing for a Jewish war, right? I think this is something that we all have to accept, but also really think about. This is Hannah Arendt saying we need to fight. We need an army. We need to not sue for peace. I think a lot of what she's saying here could apply very similarly as well to what's going on in Ukraine. What does it mean to fight a war as a Jew or as Ukrainian? And so the majority of these columns are a critique of those in the Jewish community who are not willing to fight and support meaningfully the raising of a Jewish army and the decision to fight as Jews against anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism in Germany, but also against anti-Semitism around the world. And that is really the theme of these columns. They're broken, the columns between 1941 and 42 are broken up into three parts. The first part is largely about, and let me just say the three parts. I think the three parts are all related to an unthought out, and I mean that in the sense that at this point it's not thought out, attempt to articulate what a Jewish politics would look like, right? And so to that extent, these columns are actually important in our attempt to understand the early germination of an Arendtian idea of politics. Clearly, that's what drives her writing here. The discussion of politics and what a Jewish politics would look like is at the center of her thinking in 1941 and 42, as she's writing these columns about the Jewish war that isn't happening. The first idea, or the first sort of central claim about Jewish politics that she makes is that we need a Jewish army. You need a Jewish army for the defense of Palestine. You need a Jewish army to fight anti-Semitism. She says that what we've learned is that not only the Jews can't be safe anywhere, they can't depend on charity, but that, in fact, any people now can't be safe if they don't have their own army. And so she says the defense of Palestine is part of the struggle for the freedom of the Jewish people. And we need to mobilize for that defense to get wider circles of support. And that's what politics is. Part of the argument here is that for the Jews to survive, they need to do more than survive. They need to do more than simply exist. You need to actually not exist simply as a living being, but as a thing of value. And that's on 137. And so she says, freedom is not a prize for suffering endured. You don't continue to be as Jews simply by enduring suffering. You continue to be as Jews when you defend yourself as the person you are attacked as. And if you're attacked as Jews, you defend yourself as Jews. And so you see the early formulation of that idea here on page 137 in the column from 1941, the Jewish Army, the beginning of Jewish politics, ? In this early column, she's basically saying that Jews fighting under a Jewish flag, visible to themselves, but also visible to Britain and visible to everyone, is an essential step in the Jews becoming a people like everybody else. The Jews, she says, were no different from anyone else. We too should be a people. We too should engage in politics. That's on 138. And then she adds that the existence of a people is definitely too serious a matter to be left to the rich. This, of course, is another theme in these columns, which is that for too long the Jews have depended on two different groups for their survival and protection. One are princes and courts, so court Jews and princes and kings who guarantee Jewish protection in return for certain financial help. And the second are Jewish philanthropists who in a sense, who support and protect the Jews, but in doing so, have become sort of like our sort of de facto rulers. And another one of the themes of these essays is that a real Jewish politics can't depend upon charity. It can't depend on charity from others. It can't depend on charity from even rich Jews. And it can't depend on charities from so-called friends who want to be recognized by us as our protectors. And that's the topic of the first column in this section, where she writes about Jules Romain, who's the head of the writers group PEN in France, and who she thinks is one of those people who wants to be seen as be lauded for his small acts of defending against anti-Semitism, whereas what she says is that you have to understand that in a political battle, there are only enemies and friends, but no benefactors and proteges. And Jules Romain wanted to be seen as a benefactor of his Jewish proteges. And I think this sort of claim for the rise of a Jewish politics, the refusal of benefactors, right? This is something that, as I opened with today, who is the addressee of this, right? To what extent today do Jews still rely on benefactors? And to what extent do other oppressed groups or minorities still rely on benefactors? And in doing so, do they become proteges? And Arendt is here calling for a politics that rejects both benefactors and proteges. She is worried that Palestine would be an answer to the problem, the Jewish question, or the problem that Jews face. Her basic worry is, I think, quite simple, which is that if Palestine is imagined as the protege of great powers, be it Britain or now the United States or anyone, it is never safe, and Jews are never safe because those great powers can be infected with anti-Semitism. And so the only way that Palestine is the answer, if it's based on a real politics of independence. Now, given that, this, you might say, oh my God, is what kind of politics is she talking about? Is she talking about a kind of, Jewish first politics? Well, I mean, it's important to read the column on page 146 forward against the Committee for the Jewish Army, right, which is a committee tied to this idea, what she calls a fascist politics in Israel. And Arendt is consistent throughout her life in arguing against a kind of right-wing fascist politics in Israel. She does it here in 1942. She does it again in 1948 when she signs a letter with many people, including Albert Einstein, against supporting the visit of Menachem Begin and funding him when he comes seeking money for what she considers to be a fascist party in Israel at the time in 1948. And so, what I think this does is it helps us to see the nuance of some of her argument. We do need Jewish independence, she thinks. We do need a Jewish army, she thinks. We do need to be free from benefactors, both external and also philanthropically internal Jewish benefactors. We need a from the bottom up Jewish political movement, but we don't need a kind of a racist or fascist movement that will make Israel or the Palestinian homeland or whatever we want to call it into a Jewish state that doesn't include other citizens. And that is, I think, consistent in her writing. The second aspect of Jewish politics that she talks about, before I get into that, the last thing I want to mention is on page 157. I thought a very important line in the essay called "The Devil's Rhetoric." And in this, on page 157, midway through the page, she writes, "The idea of a fundamental natural inequality of peoples, which is the form that injustice has taken in our time, can only be defeated by the idea of an original and inalienable equality among all who bear a human countenance." This is an extraordinary claim, and I think it's one that actually suffuses much of her writing throughout her career and plays a big role in the origins of totalitarianism as well, which is a kind of Enlightenment universalism on her part. She fundamentally believes that what she'll call in the origins the idea of humanity or the idea of the human is an absolutely essential idea. And the opposition to that idea is racism, which supposes a fundamental inequality. And so in this paragraph, she says the idea of a fundamental natural inequality of peoples, right, which is the form that injustice takes, can only be defeated by a kind of inalienable equality among all human beings, which is a kind of universalism. Susan Neiman, who is an American but lives and teaches currently in Germany and runs the Einstein Forum in Germany, was at Bard last week and gave a talk in which she argued that one of the great tragedies of leftist political thinking in the last, take your pick, 20, 40, 50 years, has been the rejection of universalism, the fear of making universalism, and the rise of an overemphasis on particularism and difference, especially strong in certain identitarian strains of politics, which she was talking about. And I think here, Susan Neiman is a good Arendtian in many ways, and I think here is an example of Arendt's universalism that's worth us being aware of. The second political activity of Jews, if the first is the emergence of, from the bottom up, a Jewish politics without support from philanthropists or external benefactors, and a Jewish army. The second, she says, is the rise of a new politicization of Russian Jews. So Russia is at this point obviously coming into the war, and Russian Jews had been emancipated, at least formally, by the Soviet Constitution. And they had, in Arendt's telling, and this is again a telling of a West European Jew, but in her telling, the Russian Jews had largely been excluded from the history of Europe since the beginning of the Soviet Union. They'd been emancipated, but they were not part of the European experience at this time. They were freed, she says, both from anti-Semitism and philanthropic domination on 173. I think it's certainly a contested concept that Russian Jews didn't experience anti-Semitism at this time in the Soviet Union. I don't know enough to say how much that's true or not, but it certainly would have been surprising to me. But that's what she says on 173. And she says that these newly emancipated Soviet Jews suddenly start demanding airplanes and tanks that they want to name after Jewish heroes and with which they want to fight Hitler. And so she sort of comes to see this popular rising up of the Russian Jews as an expression of political will, and thus as the beginning of another Jewish politics. The third section of these columns, as they're presented by the editors, is on the crisis of Zionism. And in this case, again, it's the same crisis. It's the question of politics. And you see sketches for you, again, the internal debates within Zionist literature, Zionist politics, Zionist conferences, Zionist congresses, between those who would help form a political Jewish people from the bottom up, and those who are too tied to benefactors, be they external or philanthropic, and want to, in a sense, exclude the people and keep peace. And this is the worry she has, that the benefactors, the philanthropists, will win the day, and in a sense preserve the status quo even after the war, in which nation states will return and Jews will be divided. Well, the countries of the world will be divided into those countries that want Jews to leave and those in which Jews are not allowed to enter. Okay, she ends, I should say, on page 184 to 185 with a short hint of what is to come, and what I think will become probably the most exciting and important part of this book as we get into it, which is the question of federalism and federations. So on the last paragraph on 184 to 185, she says, on the other hand, these new political Jews would support all efforts for a federated Europe, because within such a union of nationalities, the Jewish question is solvable and guarantees can be given to Palestine as an area for Jewish settlement. The point here is that if you really want to create a Jewish politics, and thus you want to change the status quo, you don't want to simply turn Jewish politics into a call for a Jewish nation state, right? This is why, as we get into this, she's going to break with Zionism, insofar as Zionism, in her mind, becomes controlled by a Jewish intellectual elite class that demands a nation state, and thus upholds the status quo of nation states, for which she thinks are largely responsible for the crisis that led to World War II. Okay, maybe I'll stop there and let us get into a discussion. As you all know, you can continue to discuss and talk in the chat. Please be civil. You can also raise your hand and engage in the discussion here to the extent we need to or will. We can pick out questions from the chat. And if people see questions in the chat that they think are important and like to discuss, please let me know. I don't have time often to listen to all of you and also read the chat, so I'll do my best. Okay, first question comes from Piper.
I just wanted to make a comment. I found this page is very interesting because I also was at the same time watching the Ken Burns documentary, Jews and the, America and the Holocaust. And so much of, I try to think of, she was experiencing all that when she was writing this. I mean, she already came over, but they took her out of a camp. She's one of the people that was kind of saved. I find a lot of her talks very odd because she is a privileged Jew, and very different Jews live differently all over the world. And she doesn't seem to really ever get into that. But it is interesting. And then, so on the one hand, she says, we have to fight as Jews. And then she says, but you have to be like everyone else. So I think she's very conflicted, but God, how she grew up, I don't know how I would feel. It's bad enough now, but just some comments, that's all.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, when just to be clear, when she says, we have to be like everyone else, that's not different from we should be Jews, because what she thinks is everyone else has the right to be who they are. Poles have a right to be Poles. Germans have a right to be Germans. English have a right to be English. Jews should have a right to be Jews. And so she wants Jews to be able to fight as Jews like everyone else can fight. She talks about how when some Jews who were fighting with the British troops raised a small Jewish flag, it caused an international crisis. Why? Because Britain has enough anti-Semites in it that it didn't want to be seen as fighting a war for Jews. Right? That was the issue at the time. At least one of the issues. The other issue is that it didn't want to upset the Arabs who were also in its protectorate. But both issues are important. And Arendt's like, look, we can't be so afraid of upsetting our quote unquote protectors that we can't fight as who we are. And we should have the right to fight as who we are, just like everybody else. And I think these are questions you see happening around the world today, whether it's in Ukraine, right? To what extent can people are like, especially in Europe, people were very worried about Ukraine fighting and going too far and provoking Russia, and should Ukraine have to ask, even today, Ukraine gets certain weapons from the United States, but we set limits on where they can fire them, right? They can't fire them into Russia. We have said they can fire them into these 4 protectorates that have gone through these sham referendums and declared sham independence. But that kind of those kind of questions are the kind of questions that Arendt is I think raising here, and certainly worth our paying attention to. The documentary you mentioned, which was made by Ken Burns on America and the Holocaust, which features a number of my colleagues at Bard in it, including Leon and Daniel Mendelsohn and others, is certainly relevant and worth mentioning here, because it again goes to Arendt's contention that in the end you can't trust other people to save you. People, if anti-Semitism is the problem, the only people who can really fight it are Jews. Now, the one exception to that is what she says is, and I think this is one of the more interesting parts of part of what she's writing about. People like Clemenceau, right, during the Dreyfus affair, Clemenceau didn't support Dreyfus to help the Jews, she says. He supported Dreyfus because he wanted to save the French Republic. And if you want to save the French Republic, you have to treat people with dignity and humanity. I think the same can be said about questions of, I think in the debates around things like allyship, which is a word that at least is taught today in my kids' schools. I don't know how many of you are familiar with such words. But what does it mean to be an ally? The way it's taught, as far as I've been able to understand it, is to in a sense, be kind to and support victims in the name of a kind of solidarity or sympathy with victims. That's exactly what Arendt would fight against, right? That kind of allyship. For her, I don't know if allyship's the right word, but solidarity would mean a solidarity with humanity as part of a Republican ideal, small r Republican, in the sense of treating all people with respect and the right to participate in a political world. Is that, you want to respond at all, Piper? Or?
No, there's just too much, and there's so many people that want to talk. So thank you.
Okay, Bob, you're up next.
Yeah, I think we have to concede that Arendt let herself be duped by this Russian group. Nothing happened in the Soviet Union, the Stalinist Soviet Union, without Stalin and his cohorts knowing what was going on. So I think she let her enthusiasm for her idea of Jews fighting for themselves run away with the concept.
So yeah, as I said, I when I read this, I had a similar reaction, and that's why I said I'm not totally sure of the history here. I don't claim to know as much about it. I do know that in the formal Soviet constitution, Jews were emancipated. I don't know, this is 1941. So yes, it's certainly Stalin at this point. I certainly don't think she's making a claim to say Stalin emancipated the Jews. But I think you're right. We should take it with a grain of salt. The point she's making is the Jews in Russia, after X number of years of not sort of engaging in European politics, suddenly are saying, arm us, give us money, give us weapons, and we'll fight with you. And she's reacting to the spontaneity, the spontaneous political action of these Jews in the Soviet Union, which she respects in its spontaneity and in its politics and in its freedom from a claim for an external benefactor. That's, that I think is fair. But I certainly, share your skepticism about the general emancipatory desires of the Soviet Union. So I'm with you on that.
Well, the spontaneity that you talk about is very suspect.
Okay. All I can say is I don't know. I mean, and I don't know what she's reading or what she's hearing or any of that. I mean, if anyone knows more about this period of Jewish life in the Soviet Union in the early 1940s, please chime in, because it's not at all something I have an expertise in. So, I mean, I don't, yeah, I mean, I think it's very possible she lets her enthusiasm get the better of her here.
I think
Roger?
part of the problem is we don't know, was Ukraine considered Russia then? Because
Well, yeah, 'cause it's part of
Bobby Yar, I think, was late 30s, early 40s. I mean, Jews were being killed. I don't know if she knew about it then. And so there was a lot of I don't know what she would call that, anti-Semitism, or just the people being in the wrong spot at the right time, kind of a thing.
right.
Roger, the oddity about the emancipation or the ability for Jews to be a nation may have not been applicable at that point in time, but 30 years later and 40 years later, it played a very critical role in the in Russia, with the dissidents that were able to leave because they were considered another nation.
Right.
And also the impact of the immigration or emigration from Russia to Israel played a vital role in that, in the Constitution, and that allowed an escape hatch for them. So, I mean,
Yeah, no, I mean, I think both of what Piper and John have said is important, right? On the one hand, clearly there were pogroms and massacres going on in the Soviet Union, and yes, Ukraine is part of the Soviet Union at this time. And so I don't know, but I assume Arendt is aware of that. She's plugged into Jewish world circles, so I imagine she's aware of that. When she talks about anti-Semitism, I think she's really talking about political anti-Semitism, not that what she would call that kind of Jew hatred, social anti-Semitism. And what John is saying is also right, which is that, in spite of that, there were certain formalities of the Soviet Constitution that took Jews seriously in their humanity as peoples that Arendt clearly found meaningful, even if it didn't get taken seriously over time. And as John said, did have a kind of offer the Jews as a kind of escape hatch as a people. But yeah, not sure I know. I mean, whereas her discussion of the Jewish army and Zionism will obviously continue for the next 25, 30 years of her work. This discussion of Russian Jews is an aberration. It's not going to come back. And so it's, I think, more interesting historical note here more than anything substantial in her work.
Just quickly, at this point in time, Arendt is not aware of the purges and show trials that took place in the Soviet Union in the 36, 37, nor of the famine in Ukraine. So she's really doesn't seem to be able to be receiving a lot of information about what happened in the Soviet Union in the 30s.
Yeah, I imagine you're right, although I don't know, but I imagine you're right. And clearly by the time of 1950, late 40s, when she writes The Origins of Totalitarianism, she's quite aware of it. And she thus adds an entire sort of counter or supplementary part of the Origins, in which she's looking at totalitarianism both in Nazi Germany and Bolshevik Russia. But at this point, clearly her focus is on Nazi Germany. So next is Ron Feldman, and welcome, Ron. He's one of the editors of this volume, along with Jerry Cohn. It's nice to see you here.
Thanks for having me, Roger. Yeah, interesting discussion, and thank you for your lecture. Just on the most current point, my understanding is that during the war, which is the period we're talking about, the Russians were not pursuing Jews per se, and all the massacres that happened there were perpetrated on Russian land. was perpetrated by the Nazis, such as Bobby Yar that was mentioned before. So I just want to clarify that in terms of timing. But in terms of some of the theoretical issues you brought up, I thought I just wanted to respond and highlight a couple of things. One is this tension between universalism and particularism that comes up with her in terms of human rights and also peoples. Like she is really formulating this notion of peoplehood as the Jewish people, which is a term she uses a great deal throughout this volume and elsewhere. And the question is always like, well, what is Jewish people? It's kind of a transnational, not nation state bound concept at the same time that nation states are the political form that creates armies and that creates treaties. And she also has this very large discussion elsewhere about citizenship, which is basically citizenship in a nation state. So if you're not part of a nation state, you're not really safe, and you can't create an army, and you don't have rights. Yet she's advocating this notion of peoplehood that is not quite a state, because she doesn't want to go whole in terms of Zionism. She's kind of going partly in with this notion of peoplehood, together with a homeland, which again, she doesn't want to be a state per se. So there's this ongoing tension, and it's a way in which I've always thought that her concept of trying to argue for a Jewish army is very problematic, because like, who's going to organize that? Who's going to finance it? Who's going to, let alone what flag it's under, you know? So that's a challenge. And then also when she talks about people, she talks about organizing from bottoms up. And I really take seriously her critique of the financial elite that arrogates to itself leadership of the Jewish people. And we can see contemporaneously, at least outside of Israel, in the United States and elsewhere, that structure of the wealthy being the de facto leaders of the Jewish people continues to be the case, whatever political side of the spectrum they're in. I think particularly about Sheldon Adelson and his connection to Trump. And the question about organizing people from the bottom up, she wants the people not to be beholden to these self-appointed leaders, yet she's also quite against the populism, you know, this term populism, which tends often to be very right-wing, which she's quite against. So there's a tension of like, okay, well, where are her masses on the more progressive side that she would like to see? I don't really see a mechanism or a movement that she's fomenting to offset, to create a Jewish army with a different idea other than these right-wing groups that want to create the Jewish army that she's not sympathetic to. So there's these tensions that I come away feeling a little bit dissatisfied with the resolution.
Thanks, Ron. I think those are actually both really important points. You know, the first point, if I understand it, and I think I do, and I think it's really excellent and meaningful, is, you know, what would it mean to have a Jewish people that could raise an army and have some citizenships without creating a Jewish state? I take that to be the question. So for her, a Jewish state is not to be desired, because it will, I mean, to the extent it's a state, as a Jewish state, it has to be a fascist state, I think, in her telling, insofar as that it has to make non-Jews second-class citizens, and is just, therefore, has the same problems as any other nation state. And so she talks, as you said, about things like a Jewish people or a Jewish homeland, or a federation, in which there's Jewish Arab Federation. But then what does it mean to declare a Jewish army or to call for a Jewish army? Who's going to pay for that? And how's it going to be structured? And I think these are important questions you raise. I don't think they're insolvable, right? I think one can imagine a federated state in which each state has their own army. Think about the United States. We have 50 states, and each state has its own, what's it called? National Guard or whatever we have, right? And there's also a federal army, but there's also a federated, a state-based army. So I don't think these are impossible questions to, I don't think these say, oh my God, it's incoherent. I don't think she's thought it all through. And, obviously she's, there's a lot of practical politics involved. But I think, you've raised some important questions to the extent that what does it mean for a people to have an army as opposed to a state? And I think that's a worthwhile. Now, I don't think it's impossible. The second part,
Can I just respond to
yeah.
that?
I
Yeah.
think this is linked to her curiosity. I'll call it curiosity about alternative political structures such as the Commonwealth or United Nations or federations or at a different level, councils. I think she's trying to find alternative paths through this, I call it reified political structure, the nation state structure that feels inevitable because it's what is, So yeah, please go ahead, Roger.
No, I think that's right. And I think we'll get more into that as we go further into the book, because she's going to write a lot more about it, and we'll have more chance to talk about it. But I think it's good to raise it. The second question, or not the comment you made, which I thought was good, is that and this is, I think, a broader political point, but how does one, like Arendt does, embrace a kind of bottom-up democracy and yet distinguish that from populism or demagoguery, right? It's what is a demagogue? It's someone who speaks for the people. What is democracy? It's ruled by the people. I mean, if you just look at the etymologies, right? I think some part of the answer has to be that Arendt is less a Democrat than she is a small r Republican, and that she does believe in self-government, but she believes in self-government within certain constitutional and universalist humanitarian strictures. And so there was a part of this text, and I'm trying to find it quickly and I'm not finding it, where she talks about demagogues.
Page 145.
Thank you. I knew it was around there. I was on 146. All right. So on 145, she's talking about Blumenfeld's speech on the Jewish army. And she says at the bottom of this paragraph, thank you, whoever said that, only a few individuals find the language of the people, and do so only when they know that they are allied with the people. Whereas all demagogues who think of themselves as leaders or members of an elite are fluent masters of the language of the mob. So here you have a distinction between the people and the mob. She's going to make a distinction in origins between the mob and the masses as another distinction. I'm a little more clear on that distinction because I spent a lot more time on it. And I don't think it's the same as this one, but I think what she means here, well, I think the mob, she's probably going to use in the same way here as she used it in Origins. The mob are those people concerned with power. Power, pure and simple. They want to come out on top. And insofar as you're a demagogue, you are an elite member who can speak to the mob, to mobilize the mob, to inflame their passions, so you can help them come out on top, and in doing so, win power for yourself. That's populism and demagoguery as she understands it. She says only a few individuals, counter to this, find the language of the people, and do so only when they know that they are allied with the people. I take the people here, right? I'm just trying to make sense of this, Ron. So, bear with me. To be something along the lines of the kind of universalism that I mentioned earlier and that you were responding to. The people as a Republican ideal, a small r Republican, the people as a constitutional structure, the people as what Clemenceau was talking about when he defended the rights of Jews in France during the Dreyfus affair. And so it's not simply that you're a demagogue, that you speak for the people in the sense of the majority of the people, but you speak for the people as an idea or an ideal. And yet you can do so in the language of the people, that you can make it understood. And I think that's what she's talking about here and aiming for. Obviously, it's a hard thing to do. She says there are only few individuals who can do it. Part of what she is referring to throughout this section is she wants to find somebody who can speak the language of the people and argue for the people, the Jewish people, to form an army, right? And the fact that that doesn't happen means that nobody emerged who could do it, or at least that's one reading of it. And I think that would be the right reading of it in her terms.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I think another sort of interesting question listening to this, and also it came up in the chat again, well, what is the Jewish people, right? I think it's interesting to ask, again, who is she addressing here? And the question is she addressing a constituency of some sort, like a real existing people spread over the world? Or is in fact what she's doing here also a kind of invocation of the people? So a people in the sense that does not pre-exist her calling on that people, her invocation of that people, which would then sort of like raise the question, like, what is the purpose of her writing here? Is she, in other words, trying to constitute a people through her writing and by invoking them?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. She's writing an Aufbau, so just to be, I'm not 100% sure, but let's say my guess is that people reading Aufbau are educated German Jewish refugees. It's not exactly the workers and the laborers and others that she's addressing here. I don't think she sees herself as a politician. I don't think she sees herself as the kind of individual who can find the language of the people. I think she's talking to other educated people like herself, hoping that maybe one of them is, and trying to convince them. I guess that's the way I read it. I don't know. Does that sound right to you, Jana?
Yeah, but I think she's also, like, there's a theoretical dimension to what she's doing, right? Like we were saying in the beginning, I think it's totally right that like this notion of the people is very vague and somewhat unusual for her to establish here. And like Ron was pointing us to this too, like it comes up again and again, but it's not perhaps and the same kind of people that we know from other writers, right? Like the sort of like it's certainly not a nationalist version of the people. It's not a kind of like pathos of the people, right? So it reminds me much more of this kind of invocatory dimension of her usage of the people. It reminds me much more sort of like later theories of community in French theory, for instance.
Right. Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's important. I think this question of a people is important for her, especially if we're going to bring out to some degree the federalist angle of her work, because part of what she's going to argue is that there can be an Arab part of it and an Israeli and a Jewish part of it, and that therefore there can be a kind of people-oriented part of federalist structures. I mean, I think that's part of what she's aiming at. But and there are certainly difficulties with that. Let's keep this conversation going as we get further into it. Fran, you're up.
I would like to go back to Jana's question. What's the purpose of these pieces? Because that I was asking that myself. I found them very moving because yeah, they were full of like outrage and frustration and kind of like also like helplessness, I guess. But I also thought that she kind of like talked like a warrior. She wanted the battle and she wanted to engage in this battle. But the more of these pieces I read, the more I asked myself, like, what role does the written word play in an actual war? And what were these words supposed to be? Like, were they supposed to be weapons that she would hand over to the people she was addressing? Or were these daggers that were supposed to stab the people she was addressing, if she was addressing her own people, so to say?
Yeah. I think, what I really liked about what you said was just the sort of sense of frustration, rage, helplessness, and yet also, I'll add this, I mean, incredible conviction, right? She really has a sense that, she knows the mistake the Zionists are making, which is, I think, part of who she is. And clearly she's fighting internal battles. She's fighting battles against, one form of Zionists and trying to support other forms of Zionists. And so she's talking to people in those struggles, trying to sway the balance. Yeah, I mean, this is someone who, in a sense, is engaged in very high-level inter-party politics as sort of a fellow traveler trying to influence the way party goes, the Zionist party, the Zionist movement, right? I don't know, Jana, do you want to respond to Fran at all, or? No?
Can I ask like a follow-up question?
Yeah.
It's somewhat related. It's like on 163. I just want to know if this paragraph is in the middle. It's kind of like part of like this sort of like helplessness or being pushed into a corner where it becomes almost impossible to think of anything. But so on page 163, it says, there was once a happy time when man could choose freely, better dead than a slave, better to die standing than on your knees. And there was once a wicked time when intellectuals grew feeble-minded and declared life to be the highest good. But now the dreadful time has come when every day proves that death begins his reign of terror precisely when life becomes the highest good. that he who prefers to live on his knees will die on his knees, but no one is more easily murdered than a slave.
Yeah.
So this question about like life, or like, is that really a problem? Life being the highest good?
Oh, she thinks so, yeah. And this is something that's consistent in her writing, right? She thinks that to turn life into the highest good is to dehumanize man. It turns us into animals, right? Who it's better to keep people alive than to let them live meaningful lives. It's part of the reason for her opposition to human rights, insofar as human rights are understood as the effort to keep people alive or the right to life. She doesn't think there is a right to life, right? We're all going to die. She thinks that if anything, there's a right to die well, which means to die meaningfully. But she thinks the one true human right and is the right to speak and act in public in ways that matter, to be part of a polity, to be in some way to matter. And that separates us from animals. And so the dreadful time has come when you think that life becomes the highest good, we will be content to keep people alive in camps and feed them and let them live, in her mind, in a way that is completely precarious. What Giorgio Agamben, and in this sense, he's a true student of Hannah Arendt, calls bare life. So yeah, I think this is a passage that I think is deeply consistent with her thought throughout her writing career.
What you just described as like having a meaningful life, she describes here that you don't become immortal by chasing after life. Like, what importance does immortal have? Or like, why is becoming immortal important?
Good, great catch. So if you go back and look at the introduction to the human condition, right? The third part of the introduction is on immortality versus eternity. And much of the human condition is an articulation of what it means to live a meaningful life. And to live a meaningful life is to act or speak in public in ways that matter. And if you do that, and speak and act in ways that matter in public, people will do what? They will talk about you. They will tell stories about you. And thus you will be remembered. And that's what immortality is. So immortality for her is the human potential in every human being to have lived a meaningful life and thus to be remembered.
Okay, thank you.
And I guess we should also remember concretely that she's at her most politically active during this precise moment, right? With this New York group of young Jews around Magnus, where they're trying to sort of like delay the foundation of the state of Israel in a certain way, and they're trying to agitate against the Zionist groups. So she's also writing to that very concretely with these articles. Yeah.
That's exactly right. I mean, there are moments in her life when she's politically active in France with the Youth Aliyah, potentially also in 1933 in Germany with the Zionist organization when she gets arrested. But I think Jana's right. This may be her. I mean, this is the time in her life when she's most politically active in the sense of trying to create a Zionist politics, and is very active in that. She loses, right? I mean, her side loses. And that's when she will eventually write Zionism Reconsidered, which we'll read in a few weeks or a few months. But this is her political gamble in her life. Jason.
Yeah, good evening. There's all these icebergs of great thought kind of mixed into this, but I am more than a little lost with there seems to be like a phenomenon within Judaism that inclined intermarrying and et cetera, things like that. Yeah.
Can you turn your camera off, and maybe, because we're having a lot of trouble hearing you, maybe it'll help with the sounds.
Try that. Is that any better?
I think so.
Okay. It's okay. So yeah, I'm just I'm struggling a little bit with the background of how she's exploring ideas, and maybe I'm just getting overly distracted by that. But let me just throw this out here and see if anyone has a thought on it. But there seems to be, a phenomenon in Judaism that there's a desire for a purity, a disinclined to intermarrying, and a perspective such as that maintains the integrity of the community, and that, to my understanding, that those kinds of activities are a big way that cultures merge and become something new. And now I know next to nothing about this, but the only thing I understand is that I'm not a Jew because only my great-grandfather was Jewish in my lineage. And that this is as much as I've understood. I mean, is there a sense, that there is an active segregation in the 20th century? Or was there like periods of amalgamation waxing and waning over the centuries that could help me understand some of the context that Arendt is writing from? I mean, I know that what she's pulling from this is fascinating and new. It led to more work, but I'm trying to not get too more distracted on these points of minutia.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there obviously are rules about who is a Jew and who isn't a Jew. I don't think those are the kind of questions that Arendt is here concerned with in the least. I think she's concerned with the question of the fact that there's a war of extermination going on against the Jews around the world, starting in Germany, and anti-Semitism around the world is making it hard for the Jews to fight back. And she's trying to develop what she thinks would be a political response to what she considers to be a political attack. The question of who is a Jew, I don't know what her opinion on any of that is. I don't think it's very important to her at this point. And I don't think it has any role in the political question of how Jews fight back. What she would say is, it's very simple. You're a Jew if you're attacked as a Jew. Right. So it doesn't matter who your, mother is or your grandfather is or whatever. If the Nazis think you're a Jew, you're a Jew. I don't have much more. I don't know what else to say about it, but that's how I think she reads it.
Thanks.
Yep. Hannah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I do. Yes, I can.
So I've been chomping at the bit to say a couple of things. One, Piper, I feel like I have to say, when you said, or were the Jews at Baba Yar just by chance? Did you say something like that, or did I get it wrong?
I was making a joke.
A joke?
It not a joke, but I don't think, Hannah, that I want to get into it online like this.
Oh, okay. I just didn't know whether you knew that it was the massacre.
Yes,
was
I know exactly what went on.
Oh, okay. Okay, fine. It wasn't an accusation or anything. I just didn't know if you were being serious or not. Okay. I think, like, this discussion and reading these pieces and drove me to consult the highest authority we have, which is Mr. or Mrs. Google,
I knew that.
and to get some terms straight in my mind.
Yeah.
So for one, I got this. While the terms country, state, and nation are often used interchangeably, there is a difference. A state is a self-governing political entity. Can be used. A nation is a tightly knit group of people who share a common culture. And of course, she was against nation because the Germans, with their common culture, specifically and passionately wanted to exclude the Jews from that, who they felt were polluting their culture. And then a federation is a group of states with a central government, but independence in internal affairs. Secondly, when you talk about Hannah Arendt and Zionism, which of course is the never ever ending conundrum, you're talking about different levels of Zionism. She was a cultural Zionist pretty much versus a political Zionist. She did not like Herzl's political Zionism because she felt it was based on the idea of eternal anti-Semitism that could not ever be cured, but only be protected from by the existence of a polity that was Jewish. So yeah, she was a cultural Zionist in most ways. There's religious Zionism, there's cultural Zionism, there's political Zionism, and it all still very, very, very much going on in Israel. And it's, the anti-Zionists, of whom there are increasing numbers in Jewish studies everywhere in Israel, and they really want more of a cultural Zionism than political Zionism, I think. But I think she never ever, and then also to Jana's point, I think she was correct in stating that she was the audience, she was developing her political theory, her political philosophy of humanity, when she was writing this. But I think I don't think it was ever resolved how you could protect yourself in the way she wanted to with a Jewish army and not have a state. I don't think, because only Israel was able to form a Jewish army. Only Israel has been able to protect Jews as Jews. So I just think that's, and also another thing, what made her buy into this Russia was the only country where Jews were fully emancipated? Well, on paper, maybe the Marxists emancipated the Jews, but I think she was her mother was, very attached to socialism, even though she was an upper class Jew whose grandfather's capitalist success enabled her comfortable living before the Nazis. But I also think her husband was a committed communist, and he had a huge influence on her. So that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, a few things just on the last point first. So her husband, Heinrich Blücher, her second husband, was a Spartacist, but certainly not a communist and certainly not a supporter of the Soviet Union. I mean, Arendt and Blücher were, clearly some of the earliest opponents of Stalinism and the Soviet Union, and lost a lot of friends. And she's seen still by many people in the communist left as a traitor to the communist left.
Wouldn't you connect Spartacists to communism in some forms? It's certainly not connected to capitalists.
Yeah, but certainly not connected to the Soviet Union.
Right.
It's the anti-Stalinist.
Yeah, I mean, he was a Spartacist back in the 1930s.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, I mean,
That's why he left Germany.
yeah, all I want to say is, I don't think Arendt's comments here about Russian Jews, for whatever deficiencies they may or may not have, I don't think it comes from a kind of starry-eyed support for the Soviet system.
Okay, right, okay.
But there may be other issues. On the question of country, state, nation, federation, I think it's great to go and look at these things, because in order to read Arendt, we've talked a
I
lot
was
about
so
this
confused.
in this group, you have to actually make these distinctions and understand them. The one thing I'll say about what you said is Arendt is not against nations. And this was actually the debate that I was having with Susan Neiman the other day. She's against nation states. She's against nation states as an attempt to merge two things that shouldn't be merged, namely a nation and a state. A state is supposed to be a civil administrative body that treats all citizens within it equally, whereas a nation will inevitably elevate one group over the other based on its nationality. She has no problem with people living according to national prejudices. She just doesn't want that to be brought into a state formation, right? She defends social discrimination. She's not in the sense that she thinks it's always good, but she thinks that if Jews want to live together with Jews, they should live with Jews. If Arabs want to live with Arabs, they should live with Arabs. She gets into a lot of trouble in the 1950s saying, look, if whites want to send their kids to school with whites, we may disagree with them, but they should be allowed to do that. Just like blacks can send their kids to school with blacks.
I don't understand how you can say she was for nationalism. I think she was against nationalism because she thought that people should be able to live, let's say, in their own tribes, but within a federation of some sort where there was administration of equal laws.
Okay, I didn't say she was for nationalism. I said she was for the nation.
But that's the same thing.
No, I don't. Well, I don't think it is. I mean, she, as you said, she believes that if Jews want to live in a federation as Jews, as a nation of Jews, she doesn't have a problem with that. But the state apparatus has to be kept free from that.
Okay, but everybody says she was against nationalism. That's just a big thing about Arendt.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge misunderstanding about that. I mean, she's not for nationalism or against it. What she does say is that totalitarianism is not the same as nationalism. And I think that aspect of her work, which is very important, is completely not understood and misread by most people.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean I don't think she's a huge fan of nationalism. I wouldn't say that, but
I think you're talking about using nation with a small n,
Yeah.
nation with a small n versus nationalism, or when the nation state. So what you really are saying is she was against a nation state in which that's what you're saying. And that's the most technically correct. And I stand corrected there. And I thank you for that clarification because it's very helpful.
Okay, good. And that is right. That's what I'm saying. The last part of what you said about political Zionism and cultural Zionism, the one thing I'll say is you said she's not a political Zionist.
Herzlian.
Yeah. Yeah. There's certainly I think there's some part of what you're saying there that I agree with. But I mean, what we're reading here, right, is, as I understand it, is a call for political Zionism, and maybe not Herzl's political Zionism, but a call
Right.
for political Zionism.
Right, I see what you're saying exactly, yes, yes.
So all I'd say is there was different
It's not
ideas,
Herzlian, or however you would say it.
and certainly not Jabotinskian, right? Which is
Right, not Jabotinsky, not the revisionists, not the
Exactly.
revisionists.
Exactly. But she was a Zionist and a political Zionist.
Right,
And her side, which, as Jana said, was the side that she developed with Judas Magna, lost.
right.
And so,
But
Yeah.
everybody does call Magna a cultural Zionist these days. Everybody calls
Okay.
him that.
fine. But I mean, if they had won, they would have been political Zionists.
Exactly, okay, right. yeah,
um,
gotcha.
So once they lost, she turned against Zionism in her essay, Zionism Reconsidered. But
Okay.
I don't think she was against political Zionism. That's all I was trying to say. Anyway, it's a
Yes,
good point.
and that's a wonderful refinement for me. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I thought those were helpful. Susan.
There are two things. One, I just want to go on record to object, I guess, to her statement on page 171, comparing emancipated Jews and emancipated women as people who are trying to remove the difference between male and female, which in my view is a totally incorrect assessment of feminism. So I'll just go on record about that. But the other one, I'm wondering, is page 176, where she's talking about what characterizes the event in France this time. And she says that it's an expression of a sense of human responsibility for others, and that means an expression of political will. And ever since reading Life of the Mind, I've been sort of, had my ear to the ground about what would she say is political will? Does she think there is such a thing? And I'm wondering if, in terms of this idea of a Jewish nation and this call for a Jewish army, if that's really what she's in search of, is this political will.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, so you're on the record. On the question of political will, I think, which, the context for this, right, is that she obviously had gone to France and then escaped France and was appalled at the lack of support for Jews in France in the 30s. And then suddenly, I forget exactly what is going on in this article, but suddenly, as the French are suddenly realizing how bad the Germans are, or the Nazis are, they start to speak up among some of them. And she says we should at least be happy that these are not symptoms simply of angry self-defense, but an expression of a sense of human responsibility for others. And that means an expression of political will. I think by political will, she simply means that they are now acting politically, in the sense of claiming for themselves to be part of a political polity that is not racist. The opposite of universalism for her is racism. And so, to the extent that France, the people in France defend the Jews at this late date, they don't do so, she says, out of sympathy. They do it because they realize that they're going to lose their polity, and they're going to become racist. So that I take to be, I don't think it's will in the sense of Life of the Mind or anything like that, unless I'm missing something. But that's how I read it. I thought there was a really good line at the end of this paragraph where she says, the French have merely become sensitive to shame and do not want to have the same thing happen on French soil that has happened in Germany, Poland, Romania, and Hungary. And these are precisely the first signs of a reawakening national awareness. That's interesting within the context of the conversation I was just having with Hannah. But I think what I found important about that is that shame at being less than human, at being a racist, can be the beginnings of political action. And I think that's an important, there's a good scholar down in Florida named, I think, Manu Samotra, who's written a really nice book on Arendt and shame and the importance of shame in politics. And this strikes me as a suggestion of that. All right, we got 2 minutes. Vigdis, you get the last word.
Okay, I just had some thoughts about this, about the people and how she thinks about it. And I thought of it, as she says at the end of this Paul Tillich, she says that we Jewish patriots who have been forced for so long to do battle against both slave owners and slave mentality, we greet that person as a friend and ally who directly or indirectly helps us to eradicate the madness of racial superiority and to restore the humanity, the solidarity of the human race. So when she uses the word race, she thinks of humanity. That means all humans. That's the only way you can use the concept race, because that constitutes all humans. Yeah. And then she in a way warns us in this Confucian article when she says at the bottom of 170, the ambiguous politics of oppressed people, the nasty tendency to barter for privileges instead of fighting for freedom, the narrow-mindedness that hopes to find redemption in every change, the tendency only too common in history to play the oppressor as soon as one is liberated. This is an old worry familiar to democratic politicians. And I think that's very, very important. This is also, I think, what she was afraid of in that Zionist politics that didn't pay respect to the Arabs and wanted to have an Israeli nation state. And she says at the end in that article on page 171, few things are as important for current politics as to keep oppressed people's struggles for liberation free from the plague of fascism. This war will be won only if in its course all peoples are liberated. And that means transforming all races into peoples. And I think peoples in a way is about, yes, the Jews that want to be Jews, they have a kind of common culture. And what she said in this former article we read, when she said to unite the Jews, one of the first things she said quite harshly was to get rid of all those who didn't want to be a Jew. And that's, of course, you have to stay together as a people. And that's, you have, in a way, you have the old humanity, and then you have, these should have equal rights. Everyone should have it. But she's also very clear, it can just, you have to live within the state to get this right. That is what when she talks about this people without rights. If you don't live in the state, if you don't are a citizen, then you have no rights. But you should also be able to form the group you want to identify with, be that Jews, be that Arabs, be that, for instance, this LGBTQ people. They have also the right to be a group of people, but they have the same human rights. And then, of course, there is the individual. So you have these kind of levels in my thinking. I don't know if that made any sense.
Made a lot of sense to me. I think it was great. And I think it was really good that you brought out some of these passages that you did on 171. And so I don't have much to add. I think you did a great job. So thank you.
Thank you.
So we are out of time. Oh, this was great. I mean, this is really this a lot. I mean, very few people read these passages of Arendt, so I'm glad we're doing it. I hope you're enjoying it. I am. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and I'll see you next week. By the way, last thing, for those of you who would like to come to the conference, Rage and Reason, Democracy Under the Tyranny of Social Media, pre-registration ends on Monday, so this is the time to register. We'd love to see you there. You can always still watch it online afterwards, but if you want to come, we'd love you to register and join us in person. It's going to be a great event. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you all next Friday. Thanks very much.